Okay, today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Mem Zayin. As I said yesterday, it's a really fascinating topic. We're going to start with our two topics for today. Are number one, sitting in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeret outside of Israel, where we're constantly in this, or at least we have this issue of 2-day Yantif, which is based on the fact that many years ago they used to determine the calendar by who saw the new moon. It was done in Israel. Anyone outside of Israel wouldn't get notice until much later. And therefore, every holiday they kept 2 days just in case it was really, right? They didn't know which day it really was. We continue this custom. And therefore, day number 8 of Sukkot creates a particular interesting challenge. What's the challenge? The challenge is that on the one hand, we want to say this is Shmini Atzeret. It's different than, I'll even start with, and we're going to talk about two differences today between the 7th day of Pesach and the 8th day of Sukkot. The 7th day of Pesach is a holiday. It's a Yom Tov. And okay, so if you keep 2 days, you keep 2 days. So you have 7 and 8 and perfect. Okay, so we just keep an extra day. Very easy. First day of Pesach, same thing. 1-2 days. Okay, so it overlaps Chol HaMoed. It's not really a big deal. But, right, so it becomes, instead of Chol HaMoed, it becomes a Chag. On the 8th day, we have a bit of an issue. So the 8th day, right, we keep 2 days, Simchat Torah, and Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah and Chutz La'aretz, which, okay, also not a big deal. You just keep an extra day. But the problem is that there's mitzvot that go for 7 days of Sukkot. And the 8th day is possibly the 7th day. Now, why is this tricky? Well, it's tricky for two reasons. Number one, particularly when it comes to Sukkah. Okay, notice, by the way, nobody thinks you take a lulav on those days. Okay, but that's because lulav anyway is Rabbanit all the other days, so it's less of an issue. But Sukkah, we're supposed to sit in a Sukkah according to the Torah for 7 days. And which 7 days? It's not just any random 7 days. It's the 7 days from Tet Vav going forward. If the last day, the 8th day, is really the 7th day, then you actually have to sit in the Sukkah. But if you sit in the Sukkah, then you're basically saying you have two issues. Number one, you're saying this is actually Chol HaMoed. This isn't a holiday, right? People are going to say, oh, well, if you really think this is still Sukkot, then I can, do whatever malacha I want. This isn't really a yantif. That's number one problem, which doesn't exist in any of the other holidays, because again, all the other holidays, it's taking Yom Chol and turning it into Kodesh, a sanctified day, rather than here, it would be the reverse. Number two, it says only sit in a sukkah for 7 days. If you sit in a sukkah more than 7 days, you might have an issue of what we call Bal Tosif. You can't add on to a mitzvah and sit in a sukkah 8 days. You're basically saying the mitzvah is 8 days, not 7 days. Because of those two problems, there was really a big question about what to do. So the first topic of today is going to be, how do we handle Sukkah and Shmini Atzeret? The second topic is going to be, do we say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeret? Is it a new holiday? Is it part of Sukkot, right? It's got a bit of an identity crisis. Where does it, besides that maybe in Chutz La'aretz, maybe it's even the 7th day, but in and of itself, even in Israel, where it's clearly day number 8, we still have a bit of an identity crisis. Is this part of the holiday of Sukkot, or is it something different? So that's going to be the second discussion. So let's start at the bottom of Mem Vav Amud Bet. Amal Rav Yehuda bereid Rav Shmuel bar Shilat mishmei derav. This is what I always say, the bus driver joke, right? Remember who is speaking here, because we're going to come back to him at the end of the Sukkah. Okay, it's Rav Yehuda, right? Sometimes we don't really pay attention to names, and then we get back to them, and then we say, where did they come up before? Who? What? So remember that he starts off here. It's Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel bar Shilat, who says in the name of Rav. So we have Rav's approach here as quoted by Rav Yehuda. This isn't the same Rav Yehuda we usually quote. It's a different Rav Yehuda. Shmini Safek Shvi'i, and you have a case of exactly our case, 8th day, which is maybe the 7th day because we're out of Israel. Shvi'i leSukkah u'Shmini leBracha. It's treated as the 7th day as relates to Sukkah, the mitzvah of Sukkah, and it's the 8th day as relates to Bracha. What does Bracha mean? It means in your davening. Okay, if it's maybe Sukkot, what are you going to say? Right? On Sukkot, we say Chag HaSukkot Hazeh. When it comes to Shmini Atzeret, we say Ashmini Chag Atzeret Hazeh, or right, depending on your nusach, there's all different options, but something like that. So if you say, you have to know, do you say Shmini Chag Atzeret, or do you say Sukkot? So when it comes to the brachot and the tefillah, we say Shmini Chag Atzeret in davening, in Kiddush. But when it comes to sitting in the Sukkah, we treat it like the 7th day and we sit in the Sukkah. Rabbi Yohana Amar Shmini Lezeh Lezeh. Rabbi Yochanan, who interestingly enough lived in Israel and not in any place where this was relevant, and I want you to keep this in mind because it's interesting in terms of the way the Sukkah develops, he says, Shmini Lizeu Lizeu. We treat it like the 8th day entirely. He obviously wasn't talking about in Israel. He was talking about in Chutz La'aretz. He says, no, don't sit in the Sukkah, and obviously say Shmini Chag Atzeret when it comes to bracha. So now we're going to have two versions, and I charted this out on the sheet, two versions as to what exactly is the machloket between them. So the first option is to say the following. And in each one, we're going to have, this is what they agree about. This is the debate between them. And then we're going to have the psikat halacha, the decision of Rav Yosef about who we hold like. So each version is going to have each of those three components. Meitav kulei amalo pligi diatvina. We now say everybody agrees you sit in the sukkah. Ki pligi. So even Rabbi Yochanan, who says it's shmini l'sukkah, he didn't mean you don't sit in the sukkah, but what he meant is you sit in the machloket is ki pligi libruche. The machloket is you make the bracha in the sukkah le'shei basukah. Lemanda amal shvi'i l'sukkah. If you say it's like the 7th in terms of the mitzvah of sukkah, bruche nami mevarchinan. According to Rav, you say you sit in the sukkah and you make a bracha le'shei basukah. Lemanda amal shmini lizeu lizeh. The one who says it's considered like the 8th day for both issues, bruche lo mevarchinan. You don't make a bracha. So even according to Rabbi Yochanan, you sit in the sukkah, you just don't make the bracha le'shei basukah. What does that do? Well, that shows that you're not doing this for the purpose of the mitzvah. You are actually doing it for the purpose of the mitzvah, but you're doing what we normally call a hekel, some noticeable indicator that you're not, it resolves your issue of Bal Tosif. It might resolve your issue of Zilzul Yom Tov, because you're saying, well, it's not exactly, we're not exactly treating this like Sukkot, we're doing it a little bit differently. Rav's Shita is very interesting. He says, no, do it exactly the way you do it every other day. Amar Rav Yosef, here comes, I told you, Rav Yosef's going to paskin. Nikote Rabbi Yochanan biyadach. Stick with what Rabbi Yochanan says, which is interesting because he is from Eretz Yisrael. You would think, go with the locals, but his proof is going to be with the locals. He says, "De Rav Huna bar Bizna b'chol gdolei hador," because it's known that Rav Huna bar Bizna and all the other big rabbis of his generation, ikle'u b'sukkah b'shmini sapek shvi'i. They ended up in a sukkah, or they were sitting in a sukkah on this day, the 8th day. Meitav havu yatvu bruche lo baruche. They sat in the sukkah, but they did not make a bracha, and that's your proof. So now, whenever we have a story that proves, we can always start asking questions. Well, maybe there was a different reason they didn't make a bracha. Now, remember, everyone agrees they sit. The question is, do you make a bracha or not make a bracha? So he tried to prove from there, look, they sat, they didn't make a bracha. That must be we hold like Rabbi Yochanan. To which the Gemara gets smart and says, no, wait a minute. Let's connect what we learned yesterday. Remember we saw that opinion that maybe on Sukkah you only make one bracha for the entire holiday because it's viewed as one long day. Maybe the reason why they didn't make a bracha was because they held by that approach. And they thought that you make a bracha once in the Sukkah and that covers you. And maybe that's why they didn't make a bracha on the 8th day. But they say, no, gemire de me afar atu. There was a tradition about this story, right? We all know how stories come down with all sorts of traditions and how exactly the story went, different opinions. But the story is the way the story was told. They actually hadn't sat in the sukkah the entire holiday because they were out with the sheep shepherding. They weren't around. They were in the meadows, and then they came back on day number 8, sat in the sukkah, right, which they wouldn't have done if they were in Israel. Even if you miss the holiday of, you miss sitting in the sukkah, we all know Holchei Drachim and all those others are exempt from sukkah. So they didn't have to do this mitzvah until that day. But that day they did the mitzvah. And now what does that prove? It proves that the reason why they didn't make the bracha was specifically because it was Shmini Atzeret. Because if it was the first day they fulfilled the mitzvah, they would have to make a bracha. So since that was the first day they fulfilled the mitzvah this holiday, they would have had to make a bracha. The fact that they didn't make a bracha does indicate that we don't make a bracha, and there's Rav Yosef's proof. Second version. Ika de Amre. Some people say, everybody agrees that you do not make a bracha. Ki pligi lemetav. Yeah, so I just want to go back because I see Sarah's writing about this, right? I didn't talk about the fact that it's quite strange that all the Gedolei Ador would end up not keeping, right, not sitting in a sukkah. I mean, they obviously kept the holiday of Sukkot, but they didn't do it in the way that we would have expected by sitting in a sukkah, which is, a very interesting thing. I saw somebody put up I didn't really read it, but like a portable sukkah that you could take on a tiul with you, and I was thinking it's not, but you don't really need it according to this, right? Unless you might say, well, if it's easy enough and you could, then maybe you should, but right. But theoretically, you really don't need a sukkah if you're out and about. Now you might have said, why were these rabbis there? And what were they doing? And what was so important that they couldn't figure out a way to be back for Sukkot? Anyway, it might indicate something about the mitzvah that you don't have to. It's only if you're home, then you build a sukkah. If you're not home, then maybe you don't really need to. Anyway, let's move on though. That's an interesting thing in and of itself, that whole thing. So some people say, everyone agrees you don't make a bracha. The debate between them is, do you sit or do you not sit? If you say, or it should be shvi'i l'sukkah, if you say it's shvi'i l'sukkah, then you sit, don't make a bracha. Ulamanda, which now you're going to say that, right, Rav's opinion matches what we thought Rabbi Yohana was in the previous. Sit and don't make a bracha. The one who says it's the 8th day for this and that, that's Rabbi Yochanan, meitav nami lo yatvina. He doesn't even think you sit in a sukkah at all. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef again paskins, according to this version. Again, he's going to hold, though, not like he held in the previous, sit and make a bracha. He's going to hold like Rabbi Yochanan again, which is, in this case, Rabbi Yochanan is different. Nikota Rabbi Yochanan biyadach, and he's going to have a different proof because he obviously can't use that proof. Because according to him now, hold like Rabbi Yochanan, don't sit, don't make a bracha, do nothing. What's the reason? Here, remember, I told you, remember who started, who said in the name of Rav Yehuda, the son of Rosh Shmuel Bar Shila. So he says, Demara deshmata mane, who's the one who said what Rav said, who passed down Rav's masoret, Rav's tradition? Rav Yehuda berei de Rav Shmuel Bar Shilat. The one who said what Rav said was Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel Bar Shilat. And what do we know about him? B'shmini safek shvi'i levar misukah yativ. It's almost like, right, he sent out spies to check on him, what he was doing. And in fact, he found that, or it was known, or we don't know, I don't know if he lived in the same time period, but he says, the fact is that he sat outside the sukkah on Shmini Atzeret. He did not sit in the sukkah. So the one who gave us Rav's tradition didn't even hold like Rav. So therefore, it must be we don't hold that way. Okay? So that's his proof. It's an interesting proof, right? Just because the person who passed down the tradition doesn't necessarily mean that we hold that way, but maybe Rav changed his mind. Maybe, in any case, he holds, we must hold like Rabbi Yochanan, which comes out fascinating because according to Rav Yosef, we end up holding by someone who didn't even live in this situation, never experienced this situation, right? He lived in Israel. This wasn't relevant to him, and yet we hold like him. But again, each time his proof is brought from people living in Babylonia. So he does bring proofs from the locals. Here's the best line of this. So again, you'll see why in a minute. The Hilchatan, the halacha is, Meitav yatvina bruche lo mevarchina. The halacha is very clear cut. Okay, if all of those learning the daf know that, you're always like, where's the halacha and why doesn't the halacha appear in the Gemara? Here, it's very clear cut. The Gemara says, the halacha is you sit in the sukkah and you don't make a bracha, period. End of sugya. So why is this so interesting? Well, it's so interesting because it's not really what people do. Okay, I don't know what your family custom is, but I'm trying to even remember. It's been many years since I've been there, but I think my family custom is to make kiddush inside and then go back into the house and, do some sort of something in the sukkah, but certainly we didn't sit and eat our whole meal in the sukkah. Okay, sleeping, by the way, doesn't appear here. Why not sleeping? Some people say, first of all, the gra would sleep in the sukkah also on Shmini Atzeret. That should just be known. The second thing is that most people say you don't sleep in the sukkah because eating, you can at least make some sort of heker, as we said. It's noticeable that you're not making a bracha. Sleeping, you never make a bracha, so it looks like you're doing it for the holidays. So again, there's all this, what it appears like. You don't want it to look like you're Baal Tosif. You don't want to look like you're telling people it's really not Yantif today. So you have to do something, and with sleeping, you can't really do that. That's possibly a reason. A few things about this Hilchatan. Number one, when it says the Hilchatan, the Gemara, who wrote that? So very often it's actually a later edition. And in fact, there's some places where it appears and some of the Rishonim say, oh, that was an edit of the Gaonim and it was put in later. So first of all, to say it's super clear cut from the Gemara what the halacha is, not necessarily. It could be that this line was inserted at some future point, okay? But if we assume that this is the Gemara speaking and, maybe it's likely not an Amora, it's likely Sforaim or Gaonim, which is the time period after, but often those things ended up in the Gemara. Let's even assume whatever. Let's just assume that you are supposed to do this. And in fact, many poskim say this is exactly what you're supposed to do, even though people don't do it. What happened here? So the Aruch HaShulchan brings a very interesting reason. And he says it's basically geographical. And what he says is that when you live in a place where it's freezing cold, and it's not a normal thing to sit in a sukkah, right, which is most European countries in the middle of Sukkot, it's freezing and raining and cold and all that. If you sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, forget rain, because rain, you're exempt. But if it's cold and you sit in a sukkah, right, in Israel, you would likely want to sit in your sukkah because it's pleasant weather and it's beautiful out. And on the 8th day, you might just sit there because it's comfortable and it's nice. Now, you shouldn't, because then it's baltosik and you have all these issues. But at least one could say maybe you're just sitting there because it's nice and not to fulfill the mitzvah. But nobody in their right mind, even if you don't make a bracha, it still clearly looks like you're sitting in the sukkah to fulfill the mitzvah. And therefore, it seems that over time, the minhag changed and people, instead of sitting and eating their whole meal, they did some sort of small thing, whether it's some people go at night and not during the day. Some people are in the day, not the night. Some people, there's all different customs that develop. But most people do not sit in the sukkah without a bracha like the halacha says. And in fact, many of the poskim say you're supposed to, like, go back to the base halacha. And even if your minhag was that, you should change it. And it's always an interesting question when it comes to minhagim, how strong are our customs? Do we keep our customs even if they don't necessarily make sense and they don't necessarily match what seems to be clear-cut halacha? So that's always a very big, interesting question. And there's always opinions here and there about how we treat that. So this is one of those really interesting sugyot where that happens, where the minhag basically developed maybe for the right reason. Again, we don't really know. The Aruch HaShulchan is giving a theory. It's a theory. There could be other reasons as well, but it's a theory that might be accurate, that it changed because of geographical situations, which, maybe now are still relevant, maybe aren't. Anyway, they're right, global warming. Anyway, there's all sorts of questions about this and what one should do. Should one change from the customs? Should one not, right? This is I'm not answering the question. I'm just raising the questions. Okay. Moving on now to the second topic, which will basically take us to the end of today, which is, do you make a shechianu on Shmini Atzeret? So, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, omrim zman b'shmini shachag. You say shechianu. Shechianu is on something new, right? And what he says is, let's already compare it so that we can have our accurate comparison. Ve'ein omrim zman b'shvi'i shel Pesach. But when it comes to Pesach, we don't say shechianu on the last day of Pesach. So, right, we know that there's these differences between the last day of Sukkot and the last day of Pesach. Already we discussed the last day of Pesach is day number 7. Day number 7 of Sukkot holiday is not a holiday. Only day number 8 is. It's called Shmini Atzeret, which seems to have a bit of a different nature. And the question is, how different is it? Tomorrow we'll get to the famous Rashi Tevot of Pazal Kashav, which are the 6 ways in which Shmini Atzeret is different. Actually, it doesn't come up yet on our daf. It'll just be brought as the last comment of the sugya, which is on tomorrow's daf. So he says, you say shechianu, and you don't say it on the 7th day of Pesach. So now we're going to try to bring proofs to what he says. And as an aside, we'll get into something else a little bit. But right now we're bringing a number of proofs. Yama Rabbi Levi Bar Chama, V'itema Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina. Okay, either Levi Bar Chama said it or Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina. Teda, Shaharei Chaluk B'Shlosha Dvarim. There's 3 differences between Shmini Atzeret and Sukkot. Now, you would have thought that he's going to tell you 3 unique things about Shmini Atzeret, but at the end, he's going to tell you 3 unique things about Sukkot that don't apply to Shmini Atzeret. That indicates that Shmini Atzeret is something different. And that's going to raise question about Pesach, which we'll get to in a minute. How is it different? Sukkah, okay, we already know you don't sit in a sukkah. Again, assuming we're not talking about chutz la'aretz, you don't sit in a sukkah. Lulav, you don't take a lulav, and nisuch hamayim, and you don't do the water libations. These are 3 unique laws to Sukkot that don't apply to Shmini Atzeret. That shows that Shmini Atzeret is a different holiday. Interesting approach to say the fact that we don't do something indicates it's something else, which means it's something new, which means it gets its own shechianu. You would have expected they talk about positive things and not lack of, but something that Shmini Atzeret does have unique, but it doesn't say that. Rabbi Yehuda da'amar below kayam enasech kol shmona. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, who disagrees with Tanakama about two things. Number one, this isn't mentioned in our Sukkah, but he thinks the Nisuch HaMayim was done with 1 log of water, and the rabbis think 3 log. So that's the first thing he disagrees about. Like I said, not relevant to our topic, but that's what he says, bilog hayam enasech. But the important part is kol shmona, all 8 days. Okay, so according to him, Nisuch HaMayim was on Shmini Atzeret. So how do you say Shmini Atzeret? It's a chag b'fnei atzmo. According to him, harei chaluk b'shnei dvarim. It's different in only 2 ways and not 3 ways. Still, it's different. It doesn't matter, 2 or 3. Okay. Ihachi. So here comes the question. If you're going to say lack of a mitzvah creates a shechianu, have the same thing for Shvi Shel Pesach. Ihachi Shvi Shel Pesach nami. Harei chaluk b'achilat matzah. Right? It's different in terms of the obligation I'm pointing out here, to eat matzah. Why? Remember this from Pesach? Laila Rishona Chova. We also talked about this not long ago. Mikam ve'elach reshut. The first night it's obligatory. From there on in, it's optional. So what do you see here? The 7th day of Pesach is different from the first day of Pesach, and that the first day of Pesach you have an obligation to eat matzah. The last day you don't have any obligation to eat matzah. So maybe that should necessitate a bracha shechianu. It seems like a strange thing to say, but if you think about what they did with Sukkah, it's really one and the same. Now it's not, and we'll see why, and we'll give 2 differences. I'm sure you're thinking of at least one of these. So the Gemara answers, Hachi hashta, what? You're comparing apples and oranges. Hatam milayla chaluk miyom eno chaluk. Hacha afilu miyom nami chaluk. The mitzvah to eat matzah is only on the first night. It's not on the first day. It's only, right? It's not a daytime obligation. It's only Seder night you have an obligation to eat matzah. So we want to distinguish 7th day from first day or 8th day from first day. But you can't say this is something that applies to the whole day because it only applies at night and not during the day. So that's number 1. Ravina Amal, Ze chaluk mishel lefanav, ve ze chaluk mishel lefnei panav. The 8th day of Sukkot is different from, or Shmini Atzeret is different from all 7 days previously. Therefore, comes in day number 8 with something new. Pesach, it's not different from days number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 7th day is the same as all those other days that you don't eat matzah. You don't have to eat matzah. You can eat matzah, but you don't have to. But it's different from day number 1, but that doesn't necessitate a shechianu. It has to be something, right? The fact that all 7 days we have all these things on Sukkot, and on the 8th day we don't, that shows that the 8th day is different. But if it's the same as all the intermediate days, then it's not going to have a shechianu. So 2 reasons why that's not a fair comparison. Back to the beginning. Rabbi Yohana had said, shechianu, you say on the 8th day of Sukkot, or 8th day of Shmini Atzeret, I should call it. Then we said it's different in 3 ways or possibly 2. Now we're going to have a number of other proofs. These are specifically from the Psukim. Okay, if you have the sheet in front of you, it'll be very helpful. You can also open up Safari or Tanakh or whatever you have in Bamidbar, Perek Kaftet. Okay, chapter 29 in Bamidbar. So it lists in chapter 29 all the sacrifices you bring on those days. Okay, now to review, let's just look inside. It says in Pasuk Yuberu, Chamishasar l'chodesh hashvi'i, on the 15th day of the month. The next verse says you're supposed to bring sacrifices, 2 elim, 14 kvasim, and 13 parim. Okay, we're going to focus on the parim, the bull offerings. 13. So 2 elim, 14 kvasim, and 13 parim. On day number 2, what do you bring? Parim b'nei bakal shnei masal. You go down every day in the number of bulls. And then the elim and the kvasim stay the same. So every day you go down 13, 12, 11, 10, okay, till you get to 7 on day number 7. Okay. On day number 8, what do you bring? Skipping to Pasuk Lamed Hey, par echad, only 1 bull. So you go down from 7, instead of going to 6, you go to 1. Ayil echad, you only bring 1 ayil, and instead of 14 kvasim, you bring 7 kvasim. Okay. By the way, in all the days you bring a seir echad l'chatat. I'm not dealing with that. That's something different. That's something you bring on all holidays. The other things here are unique to Sukkot. This is, by the way, if you count the 13 bulls, 13 plus 12, 11, down to 7, you get to 70 bulls. From there, they talk about the Shivim Umot. It's this holiday of, this broader holiday and it talks all these significance of the number 70. Anyway, that's something I'm not going to get into right now. So what do we say here? Amarav Papa, hachaktiv pal, hatam ktiv parim. I'm going to show you in the psukim that this is a different holiday. Every day you bring bulls, whether 13, 12, 11, 10, etc. And all of a sudden on that day, different sacrifice, you only bring one bull. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, we're going to bring three different proofs in the verses. Hachaktiv bayom, hatam ktiv ubayom. Now, if you look at the verses, I bolded all the important words. The beginning of each pasuk Yud Zayin, it says ubayom hasheni, and on the second day. Kaf, uvayom hashlishi, and on the third day. And it goes through, and on the fourth, and on the fifth, and on the sixth, and on the seventh. You get to day number 8 in pasuk lamed hey, and it says bayom hashmini, no vav. Vav achibur connects it to the previous. This doesn't have a vav. Vav means end, doesn't have it. So what does he say? You see, 7 days are all connected. And then all of a sudden it says bayom. So here you see bayom. I'm going to go back because Becky, I see you're asking about how evangelicals come to Israel and Sukko because of the 70, this thing about the 70 nations. By the way, it comes up, it's from that pasuk that we say actually very often in Yom Kippur. It's in the context of the Nivu'ah. It comes from the prophets, and it talks about how it's about the holiday of Sukkot, and how all the Gentiles are going to come and worship God. So there's this connection in other places as well to Gentiles worshiping God on Sukkot. So I assume it comes from there more so than from this tradition about the 70, but that 70 links into those psukim, basically, they connect it. Okay, next. Third proof, Rav Ashi Amar, hachaktiv kamishpat, hachaktiv kimishpatam. Again, looking back at the verses, it tells you in the first section on the 15th, on day number 1 of Sukkot, you bring the following korbanot, and then you bring the following libations. So they basically go into the libations, all the different things that you're supposed to bring for the par, for the aisle, right? They all have different amounts. Then it says Bayom Shmini, and then it says Uminchatam v'nizkehem. I'm in pasuk Yud Chet laparim la'elim v'lakfasim b'misparam kamishpat. The way we said it previously, it's like saying ibid, right? So kamishpat, and every pasuk it says, and you bring these korbanot and bring it kamishpat. Keep saying kamishpat, kamishpat, kamishpat. You get to day number 7, and it says kimishpatam, like those laws. What does that show? It shows that this is the end. We're done, because it's saying like all those laws before, end story. So therefore, again, the cutoff is after day number 7. That shows that day number 8 is separate. Okay, so we had 4 different proofs. Okay, we had number 1, we said it's different in 3 different ways, the Nisuch HaMayim, the Sukkah, and the Lulav, or maybe only Sukkah and Lulav. Then we brought the parim, the bayom, uvayom, and the kimishpatam. Okay. Those are all textual proofs, the last 3. Now we're going to try to bring a proof for Rabbi Yohana. What you see here is nobody disagrees with him so far, although we're going to see at the very end of the sugya, we're going to see that actually someone disagrees and says, you don't say Shechianu on the 8th day. But maybe underlying all these reasons to prove is to kind of prove we hold like him and not like the other opinion. So now they're going to try to bring a Tanaitic source to prove Rabbi Yohana. Let's suggest that this source is going to prove his point, but it's not in the end. Haparim, ha'elim, bakfasim. These are all the animal sacrifices that you bring on Sukkot. Me'akvin ze et ze. They prevent each other. What does that mean? So there's actually a bit of a different opinion what this means. Either it means if you don't have all the right amount of animals, don't bring your sacrifice at all because it's not going to be accepted. Or it means if you did it but messed up one, maybe your korban's not accepted. Some way your korban's going to be messed up if it's missing one of these animals. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, parim ein ma'akvin ze et ze. Clearly, the exact number of parim is not so significant. It's an interesting proof he brings. Because what do you see? You see every day it gets less. So obviously, it's not so significant, the number. Now, you might say the opposite, right? They change the number every day. That shows it's very important, which number every day. His point is, how could the number be so significant if every day you bring a different number of parim, of bulls? So therefore, he says, clearly, the parim, the amount of bulls that you bring, is not so significant. So if you have less, it's okay. The rabbi said to him, they say, you want to use this proof that the number is not important because the number goes down as time goes on? Even the number of elim and kfasim goes down. On Shmini Atzeret, it gets cut in half. Remember, instead of 2 elim, only 1. Instead of 14 kfasim, only 7. So the fact that everything drops on Shmini Atzeret should disprove your point that just because they get lower doesn't mean that it's not significant, because you said only the parim. You should, according to you, you should say everything. To which he says to them, and that's the important part of this braita, Amar lahem, Shmini rega b'fnei atzmahu. It's its own separate holiday. Don't use that as any proof. The fact that we changed the number of animals has no significance, no bearing on what's important on Sukkot. This is a different holiday entirely. And he continues to say, just like all the days of the holiday require a korban, and the point is the korban is connected, right? It's kind of the same, but one thing changes. And Shiur, the Shiur Shel Yom, this was the song that the Levites would sing in the temple, was a unique Shiur, right? Every day it was a little different, but on Sukkot it all had the same theme. And bracha, which we're going to see in a minute what bracha means. And lina means that you have to sleep overnight after bringing, normally this is when you bring sacrifices, you're supposed to stay overnight. This seems to be a halacha in the whole holiday that you maybe, Toso kind of says this must mean, because since every time you bring a sacrifice, you have to stay overnight, the chiyuv of lina must mean because the holiday, you have to actually stay overnight in Jerusalem. It means you have to stay overnight in Jerusalem all the days of the holiday. So just like you have these halachot for Sukkot, Shmini, they have their own halachot as pertains to that. Ta'um korban, it has its own unique sacrifice. Shiur, it has its own unique song. Bracha, it has its own unique bracha. We're going to talk in a minute what that means. And lina, and it has its own requirement to sleep over in Jerusalem because of the holiday. So now they say, what is bracha? They want to use this to prove Rabbi Yohana that shechianu needs, right? You need to say shechianu. So my lav zman, is it not zman? Zman means shechianu, right? Shechianu v'gilanu lazman hazeh, right? So time, the time makes the bracha. So is it not that it needs a shechianu? Isn't that what it's saying? It has its own bracha of shechianu. So to which the Gemara, and then that would prove Rabbi Yochanan, no. Lo lebrachana mazonu tefillah. No, you could say bracha means it has its own, right? Just like we said, remember that we started today with shmini lebracha, remember? It means what you say in the davening. You say shmini chag ha'atzeret hazeh. You don't say Sukko. It has its own special bracha. That doesn't mean shechianu. So this source doesn't necessarily prove it. And now they're going to further prove that it's more likely that it's saying Berkana Mazon in Tefillah, what you say in benching and in davening, and it doesn't mean shechianu. Why? Well, for clear reasons. Hachinami mistaber di'isal kadat hachzman zman kol shiva mi'ika. They were saying here, Shiv'at Yimei Chag, the 7 days of holiday require korban, shiur, right? All those things. But you don't require shechianu all 7 days. You say it once. So it doesn't make sense to say that that line was talking about shechianu, which further proves that this doesn't provide us with any proof for Rabbi Yochanan. And they say, there is no zman all those 7 days, but the Gemara says, oh, halo kasha. That's not a question. That's not really a good disproof. Okay, what they want to say, it gets a little trickier. So I want to keep within the structure, and the sheet will help as well, which is we started with trying to bring the sources of proof and say, maybe it's talking about shechianu. We then say, no, it's not talking about shechianu, or it's not necessarily talking about shechianu. It could be talking about bracha, berkana mazon, and tefillah, right? The language that you use when you designate this holiday is different from Sukkot, as opposed to, let's say, the 7th day of Pesach, where you still say Chag HaPesach, right? But then they're going to say, and it has to be that it's talking about that. And the end, they're going to say, it doesn't have to be talking about that. It still could be shechianu, okay? Because even though you don't say shechianu all 7 days, if you forgot to say shechianu on day number 1, you could say it on day number 2 or on day number 3 or on day number 4. It's true you only say it once, but all the 7 days are potential days for shechianu. Okay, so they say, wait, but mikol makom kos be'inan. But don't you need a cup of wine? And you don't normally have a cup of wine on Chol HaMoed, and normally you say shechianu on a cup of wine. So maybe that would again prove this isn't talking about shechianu. They say, if you want to say that, Well, Lema Mesea Leila Rav Nachman. Maybe then, if you say, maybe this is talking about Shachianu, and it could be potentially said any of the 7 days, maybe that would support what Rav Nachman says. Rav Nachman, Zman Omro Afilu B'Shuk. You can say Shachianu even in the Shuk, meaning you don't need a cup of wine. Normally, we either say Shachianu, men normally say it during Kiddush, women normally say it when they light candles. And that's what we say Shachianu. We don't just say it randomly in the Shuk on nothing. Okay, so maybe this would prove the only one time we say it with nothing is when? On Yom Kippur, because we don't drink, right? So women say it on Halakat Nerot, but people who don't say it when they light candles do it in shul with no wine, because obviously it's Yom Kippur and you can't drink wine. But normally we try to have it on a cup of wine, and they're going to say maybe this supports Rav Nachman that you could say it even in the shuk. Because if you're going to say, you will do it on a cup. And we just said that theoretically you can make Shachianu any of the days. You don't necessarily have a cup any of those days. To which they say, Dilma de ikla le kos. Oh no, you don't need a kos of Kiddush. You just need a cup of wine. You could potentially have a cup of wine on Chol HaMoed, right? People drink dinner sometimes with a glass of wine. So in the end, they're going to say, this is basically, we got a little long-winded. What it's basically saying is it could be talking about Shachianu, and it could be on all the other 7 days. And it doesn't necessarily prove Rav Nachman that you can make Shachianu even in the shuk, because maybe it means if you had a cup of wine. Anyway, these are all ifs, which means it could also be talking about Berkana Mazon and davening, and it's not even talking about Shachianu at all, which means that we can't say this provides us with proof for the opinion of Rabbi Yohana that you say Shachianu on Shmini Atzeret. So we tried to bring it as a proof, but in the end, it's not a proof. Now that we brought up this Braita, they want to talk about this chiyuv of lina, of sleeping over in the temple, sleeping over not in the temple in Jerusalem, okay, on the day you bring a sacrifice, and also on days of holidays, okay, and on Shmini Atzeret on its own also. Shmini Atzeret in itself is a holiday that requires lina, sleeping over. So now they're going to question this, and that was said all according to Rabbi Yehuda, who said the Shmini Atzeret is different, right, for lina, as in addition to all the other things he said they were different. So the Sava Rabbi Yehuda Shmini Ta'un Lina, does he really hold that the 8th day Shmini Atzeret needs lina, requires you to sleep over in Jerusalem that night? The Tanya, doesn't it say in a Braita? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Minayim the Pesach Sheni she'eno ta'un lina. How do you know that Pesach Sheni doesn't need sleeping over at night? Okay, Pesach Sheni is if you didn't do Pesach Rishon, you bring a korban on the 14th of Iyar, the next month, if you didn't bring it only for particular reasons, not because you were lazy, but if you were b'derech rechoka, you were too far away, or if you were impure at the time. So how do you know that you don't have to stay overnight on the day that you go to the temple to bring your sacrifice? Shene'emal, because by Pesach Rishon it says, Ufani, the regular Pesach, Ufanita baboker, this is where they get the whole law of lina from. Ufanita baboker v'halachta lo alecha. You turn in the morning and you go to your tent. By the way, most of the commentaries say, by the way, we're obviously now talking about the morning of the 15th. And as you bring the Korban Pesach on your Dalit, the Chag is on the 15th. Okay, you bring your sacrifice that night. You bring your sacrifice during the day in the afternoon. You eat it at night. The morning should be the 15th. Of course, you're not going home in the morning because it's Yontif. So it obviously pushes it off a morning. But the concept is that you're supposed to stay overnight in Jerusalem. And only the next day do you go home. Uchtiv, and the pasuk immediately after says, Sheshek yamim tocha matzot, eat matzah for 6 days, which in and of itself is a strange pasuk because we're supposed to eat matzah for 7 days, why 6 days? There's all different ways of darshing this. We learned this in Psachim. We even delved into it more when we did the beginner's course on Psachim. But in any case, the way they understand it here is, Et she'ta'un shisha ta'un lina, ve'et she'eno ta'un shisha eno ta'un lina. When you need to eat matzah for another 6 days, meaning not just the first day, but the other 6, then you need to stay overnight. But if you don't need to eat matzah for 6 days, like for example, when would that be? Pesach Sheni, then you wouldn't need lina. Now, what else would that be excluding? Maybe it's saying that only holidays that have 7 days to them need lina. Whereas a holiday like Shmini Atzeret, let's say I didn't bring a korban on Shmini Atzeret. Often people brought Shalmei Chag and things like that. But if I didn't bring that, maybe I wouldn't need to stay overnight. So they say, right, maybe this is coming to exclude also Shmini Shechag, which doesn't have another 6 days to it. In which case, it sounds like Rabbi Yehuda, who said this here, would indicate that he would say you don't need lina, and he says in the other brayta you need lina. So the Gemara says, Lo lemiute Pesach Sheni de kavate. No, this is coming to exclude Pesach Sheni. It's saying Pesach Rishon, yes, not Pesach Sheni, which is like Pesach Rishon, but a little bit different. It's going to be different in terms of laws of lina, but it's not excluding any other holiday. It's just saying Pesach Sheni, you don't need to eat matzah, therefore you don't have to stay over. Only Pesach Sheni, it's not excluding anything else. And Hachinami Mistabra, and we're going to further prove this, although again, this proof is going to fall. But right now we're going to try to prove it from this Mishnah. Ditnan, Habikurim Tu'unim Korban V'Shir Utnufa V'Lina. Now we want to prove what Rabbi Yehuda holds. Now, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't appear in this Mishnah, but this Mishnah says, it doesn't say who's speaking. We're going to assume it's Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to prove that in another minute. The Bikurim, when you bring the first fruits to the temple, you need to bring a korban along with it. You need to have a special song sung with it. You need to do tnufa, waving. Remember, we talked about waving before with the korban shtei alechem. So you need to do a waving of the bikurim, and you need lina. Now, the question is, who's saying this? Now, if it's Rabbi Yehuda speaking, then what do you have? For the proof that he holds lina is not excluded from any time where you don't have a whole 7-day holiday, because Shavuos is not a 7-day holiday, and yet you need lina. And if this is Rabbi Yehuda, then that proves what we just tried to say. So how do we know that this is Rabbi Yehuda speaking? Because man shamat le'damar tnufa, who's the one who holds that bikurim need waving? It's Rabbi Yehuda. And so the one who says waving is Rabbi Yehuda, and the one who says tnufa, right, is lina, that must be Rabbi Yehuda. Titanya, as it says in a braita, Rabbi Yehuda omer, v'hinachto zo tnufa. Okay, before we get here, I'm going to read a few of the verses. This comes from Parshat Kitavo, which is this week's parsha, and it's talking about the ceremony of the bikurim. And first it says in Pasuk Dalet, we're in Dvarim Kafvav, Pasuk Dalet, V'lakacha kohen atena miyadecha, he takes the basket from your hands, V'hinicho lifnei mizbach Hashem Elokecha, and he places it down before the mizbech. Then in Pasuk Yud, right after that, it says, and you're supposed to say the following set of psukim, and that's Arami Oved Avi, which we say at the Seder also. And then the last verse is Vataine Veti, and now I'm bringing to you Reshit Pri Adama, the first of my fruits, Asher Natata Li Hashem, that God gave me, V'hinachto lifnei Hashem Elokecha, and I placed them down before God. So what this drasha is going to do is say, why did it say V'hinicho in Pasuk Dalet, and again in Pasuk Yud it said V'hinachto? Now the very easy answer is one was the action and one was describing the action, and really it's not extra, but in the realm of drasha, we can darshan that and say, why does it say it twice? So they say v'hinachto is teaching you that there's a law of tnufa, of waving it, not just placing it, but waving it. To which the Braita questions and says, Ata omer zo tnufa eno ela halacha mamash. How do you know it means to wave? Maybe it means just to place down. So they say, no, because it already said in Pasuk Dalet to place it down. So why does it repeat it? So tnufa, that's the teach us tnufa. So what do you see? Rabbi Yehuda is the one who holds tnufa. Therefore, he must be the author of this Mishnah that says tnufa and also says lina. So there you see Rabbi Yehuda requires lina, even if it doesn't have a 7-day holiday, which would then prove that the only exception is Pesach Sheni. And really that further proves the bright that there's no question on Rabbi Yehuda about Shmini Atzeret also requiring this staying overnight. But the Gemara rejects this proof and says, Dilma Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. You could say that that source was written by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and not by Rabbi Yehuda, that Mishnah, because he also holds Tnufa, he learns it from a different source, Titanya. V'lakacha kohen atena miyadecha, that was what we just saw. He takes the basket from your hand. Limed ala bikurim shetunim tnufa devar Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. He learns from that verse that you need to wave it. How so? My time at Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. At yad mishlamim. He makes a gzeira shava between yad here and yad in the korban shlamim. Korban shlamim, you have to wave. A peace offering gets waved. So we're going to learn from there that you need to wave the bikurim as well. There it says, right, that's by bikurim. His hands will bring the sacrifice. Makan kohen. Now we're going to learn two things. How does the tnufa work? So first we learn, just like there's waving in shlamim, there's also waving here. But who does the waving? Well, who's the subject in bikurim? It's the kohen. Whose hands are the korban in? It's the bikurim, or go to the hands of the kohen. In the shlamim, it's the owner. So they say, Makan kohen, af lahalan kohen, just like by bikurim, it's the kohen. Also in the shlamim, it's the kohen. Uma lahalan balim, afkam balim. And just like there, it's the owners in shlamim. Also in Bikurim, it's the owners, to which the Gemara says, HaKetzad. Is it the owners or is it the Kohen? We just said it's both. How does that work? Kohen meniach yado, tachat yad ba'alim umenif. Kohen puts his hand under the hands of the owner, and then they both together wave the Bikurim and the Shlabim. Okay, and that we learn from Gzer Shava. So in the end, they say the Mishnah that said Shnufan Lina could be Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and could teach us nothing about Rabbi Yehuda, in which case it doesn't hold a proof. Okay, this was all a total aside from our main topic. And the Gemara is reminding us of that by asking the following question. My Havela. So what's the halacha? In other words, you got very distracted, but where were we starting with? Rabbi Yochanan, who said Shechianu, right, which we tried to prove from Rabbi Yehuda. In the end, we couldn't because Rabbi Yehuda says bracha, and we didn't know if bracha meant Shechianu or it meant davening, in which case it didn't teach us anything about Shechianu. So what's the halacha? Rav Nachman Amar, Omrim Zman B'Shmini Shachag. Rav Nachman held like Rabbi Yochanan, we say Shechianu. Rav Sheshet Amar, Ein Omrim Zman B'Shmini Shachag. Rav Sheshet says we don't say Shechianu, which is really interesting because we're so used to that we do, but in fact there was an opinion that we don't say Shechianu. Behilchatan, the halacha is, and this is why we do it, Omrim Zman B'Shmini Shachag. At least this time we have a halacha that we do, not different than we do as with the other. But here we say Zman on Shmini Shachag, and as I promised, tomorrow we'll get to this Breita, like Rav Nachman, which is the very famous, which brings up the words Pazar Kashav, which is an acronym for the 6 ways in which Shmini Atzeret is a chag on its own. Okay, we will get to that tomorrow, and with that we'll finish. Have a great day, everyone.